Everybody, making a video titled God is logically impossible or something like that. Basically want to talk about one of my most favorite thought exercises in terms of religion is talking about the omni-attributes, the that are typically given to God. It's like all powerful, all knowing, all whatever, free will, timeless space, and stuff like that. And one of the thought exercises is seeing how incoherent and contradictory those attributes are. I've researched it for a number of years and found that they're like the attributes are contradictory, they're incoherent, they're absurd, they don't make any sense. If you try and pair them together, they contradict each other. Um, I just want to do a quick video on talking about that sort of stuff. Maybe get people to think about it. Maybe even I don't know. Maybe if I have questions or the questions that I bring up, maybe somebody has an answer to them that nobody else has been able to answer. But the topic is the incoherence of God according to his attributes. Looking this up, I've realized that the whole concept of a God does not make any sense, especially when you start looking at the qualities given to this being, to the point where I learned the term, what's called an ichtheist. An ichtheist is someone who believes the question of the existence of God is meaningless because the term God has no coherent and unambiguous definition. The position is that the religious language, particularly theological terminology such as God, is not intelligible nor meaningful. And sentences like God exists are cognitively meaningless. Attributes of God are unintelligible, meaningless, or incoherent and contradictory. That's what I said before. And we'll go through the attributes and say why they're those things. Um, so typically, when you hear people talk about God, um, especially apologists, they'll say stuff like what's called negative theology. And what negative theology is, it's the idea of describing God's attributes in a negative sense. So you'll hear tons of times people say God is immaterial, not material, timeless, spaceless, immutable, unchanging, disembodied, means not having a body, supernatural, not natural, invisible, not visible, and so on. Basically, you're describing something by saying what it's not. If you're describing something saying like it's not this, it's not that, it's not in space, not in time. You're not really describing it. What you're doing is saying what it's not. So if I had an object saying, okay, I have an object in my hand, and I try, and you ask me to describe it for you, I say, well, it's not yellow and it's not a hat. Have I described it at all? No, I have not. I've merely said what it is not. So it could be a billion other different things, but I'm not describing what it is. That's the problem. You're describing what it's not what it is. Um, so with these negative attributes, the term God cannot be distinguished from non-existence. So when someone says God does not matter, well, something that is non-existent is not matter either. God does not have limitations. Well, something that doesn't exist doesn't have limitations either. God cannot be described. Well, you can't describe non-existence either. It's essentially the same thing. If theists want to successfully distinguish between their definition of God and non-existence, then they must have a positive substance to the idea of God. You need to be able to give a positive attribute to this God, not just what it isn't, because that doesn't help at all. So we're going to go through some of the attributes that are typically given to this God and why they contradict or are incoherent. For example, timeless and spaceless. Let's go use those two attributes. Saying God lives spacelessly and timelessly, it's the same thing as saying it doesn't exist. Essentially, saying there's a being that lives nowhere and never. What does it mean to exist outside of space and time? How can that be described to a being like us humans that lives within space and time? How do you describe something outside of space and time to a space and time creature? Good luck. God is typically assumed to be a timeless, spaceless mind, as well as a changeless or immutable mind. But how can a mind exist changelessly? Consciousness is always in flux. So, how can a conscious mind be completely static? Consciousness is a process or series of events. So how can a consciousness exist without the passage of time? How can it be changeless? For that matter, what is a spaceless mind? How would you describe an immaterial mind? How would that mind be described if it was no material or matter? All this seems contradictory or incoherent. Can a conscious mind even exist not in flux? Consciousness is always changing. So how can a unchanging conscious mind actually exist? If there's no if not, then there's a contradiction between God existing outside of space and time and Him having a conscious mind. Another another claim by theists is that God created time. All right, so God is credited by theists for creating time, but it's a contradiction to say God created time outside of time. The act of creation is a process or a sequence of events. At minimum, there's an initiation phase, which you'll see in physics. It's like T0, the initiation, where things need to be set up in motion, and then the actual event itself. The delta in the events, or delta T, is time. A cause and effect sequence requires time to make happen. Some could argue that a cause and effect event would be simultaneous. Okay. But simultaneous implies time as well. It means at the same time, which means that the delta time is still zero, which still involves time. How can you define what How can you even define what simultaneous means without time involved? You need to have a sense of time to say something started simultaneously. None of it makes any sense if you think about it even for a second or critically at all. The attributes of omnipotent, which means all powerful, and omniscience, all knowing. How can an omnipotent, omniscient being know fear, frustration, or despair? Those emotions are only produced by limitations that the omni-God does not share with us. So how can this being be acquainted with all the aspects of these emotions? What does an all-powerful God have to be afraid of? What does he have to be afraid of? Why would he need that emotion? If he does know fear, is that an admission of his limitations? On the other hand, how can an omniscient being lack such knowledge? So if he doesn't know fear, he does not have all knowledge. He doesn't know what it's like to feel fear, frustration, or despair. The attributes omniscience and disembodied, meaning nobody. If God is disembodied or does not have a body, then how does he have knowledge of knowing what it's like to have a body? How then can God be both all-knowing and disembodied? There are pieces of knowledge that can only be gained by having a body. For example, only being with a body can you know what it's like to perform gymnastics, stabbing a finger for a blood sugar test, or anything like that. There are experiences that are only gained with a body. Only a dog knows what it's like to be a dog, because that's the dog's experience. An omniscient being who is disembodied is a contradiction and therefore does not exist. What about omnibenevolence? Perfectly good. It's incoherent if we presuppose mercy, forgiveness, and justice are good. These traits cannot coexist without them coming into conflict with each other. Essentially, the idea that God is perfectly good means that he is perfectly merciful and perfectly just. Essentially, everyone gets what they deserve, and also no one gets what they deserve, which causes a contradiction. If you provide perfect justice, then you cannot turn the perfect justice around with mercy. Mercy entails someone does not get what they deserve. Thus, perfect justice is not done by God. So it's saying mercy is not giving somebody what they deserve, or true justice. It's giving them a lesser thing or something that is not what they deserve. Therefore, those contradict. To be perfectly just, people have to be accountable for their actions. Unless they are not, and they're given mercy. How can a God provide perfect justice, but then at the same time provide perfect mercy or forgiveness? Those two traits contradict. The responsibility of solving these contradictions is on the one who believes in such a God. But the person needs to be careful not to make terms such as mercy, forgiveness, or justice completely meaningless. If you start changing the definition or what is entailed by mercy, forgiveness, or justice, then you might change the attributes or qualities of that God. So you need to be careful when you do that. I believe these superlative traits were added by Christians without thinking about the problems that would arise. Maybe they figured nobody would think this hard about them. Maybe the issues weren't apparent at the time. Who knows? Um, so omniscience, all-knowing, and morally perfect. Two attributes that contradict. How can this God be perfectly, morally perfect and omniscient and yet not know evil? Does God know what it is to be evil? It's one thing to know about evilness. It is another thing to actually understand the experience of being evil. If this God has experience of being evil, then he cannot be morally perfect. If he does not know what it's like to be evil, then he's not all knowing. He doesn't know what it's like to be evil. Therefore, he's lacking knowledge. What about lust or envy? If God is all knowing, then that means he knows what it feels like to have lust or envy. But if that's the case, then he cannot be said to be morally perfect, since lust and envy are deemed, at least in most Christian circles, to be morally imperfect experiences. Um, so can a non-omniscient being, like not a God, quote unquote, know more than an omniscient being? If God is both morally perfect and disembodied, then he does not know what it feels like to have lust, envy, or play the saxophone. This would mean that a non-omniscient being know a non-omniscient being know things that an omniscient being does not. Only a being with a body can experience lust, envy, or playing an instrument. Is this not an absurdity that cannot be reconciled? If you think about it, in fact, a dog knows more than an omniscient being. A dog is the only being that knows what it's like to live as a dog that a God would not possess. If God never had a body of any kind, then he does not know this experience as being a dog. The key point is that in certain topics, a non omniscient being knows more than a supposed omniscient being. The common retort or response you hear is that God only knows what he needs to know as a God, or that he only knows which is in his nature, or that's logically possible. These additional qualifiers that believers add to this God's omniscience only causes other problems. They begin to limit the abilities and knowledge of this all-knowing being. If not directly changing the omniscience, the limitations added take away from this all-powerful trait. So as soon as you start adding limitations or additions to this trait, you're lowering the bar. Also, when one uses qualifiers like God is only omniscient based on his nature, or God cannot do anything logically impossible, or God isn't the type of being who ... then the definition of an omniscient being can be attributed to other things. When these qualifiers are added, then it opens up the definition of omniscience to attribute to non-omniscient beings as well, like higher form aliens, to the point where, you start getting close to that lowered bar to where they could be considered quote unquote gods as well. There are potential beings who are quote knowledgeable based on their nature, beings that cannot do anything logically impossible, or beings that aren't the type who ... You could lower it to a higher form alien civilization. So you're lowering your bar if you try and reconcile that. And then you might hear some Christians say, well, does Jesus coming into the picture help the problem at all? Christians might say, well, God came down in flesh through Jesus. Therefore, he had a body to experience those bodily things. Therefore, it resolves the problem of a disembodied being not experiencing bodily things. Okay, but there are three problems with that. The first one, it's doubtful that Jesus would have done everything you can do in a body, which still does not solve the problem of omniscient being having knowledge of every bodily experience. Did Jesus play every instrument? Did Jesus, know what it was like to cross a gigantic ocean? Was he, it could be a bunch of different things. Obviously, he didn't do. Also, it does not provide God. The second one is it doesn't provide God with the knowledge of experience of being a non-human animal, dogs, cats, birds, which still means he lacks in those experiences and therefore knowledge. Sorry. And the third one, if God needed Jesus to gain knowledge, then God was never omniscient in the first place, including when he created the universe. He didn't know what it was like to be a human. If Jesus needed to come down to gain that knowledge, there's a problem there. The theists would have to then conclude that their idea of an omniscient God still is not solved, even with Jesus entering the picture. So, in conclusion, how do theists come up with these traits of God? They are told from a religious authority, read it from a book, or they inferred it from a book. But those traits are never discovered. They're never testable. They're never observed, they're never measured, they're never demonstrated. They're mainly just asserted and said they are true because the believer was told they were true. One question I would advocate to the believers is, how did you come up with these with your information? How did you come by these attributes? Was it from a reliable source? How was that source reliable? How did they come up with those conclusions? If we use reason alone to deduce that a proposed God is incoherent, internally contradictory, or absurd, then it can be concluded that the proposed God does not exist. And that's what I had for that. Um, Maybe somebody can solve the problems that I addressed. If not, maybe it'll get some people to think. Um, if people don't want to hear it and want to keep thinking about, you know, and living in la la land that, oh, all these attributes are okay, and I'm just gonna live with it. That's fine if they want to, but I like when my friends and family are critical thinkers and don't just take things based on what they've been told all their lives. Well, that's all I had for this video. I might make a part two because I do have some more stuff dealing with this topic. So there might be a part two in the future. See you guys.